The rain pounded against the windows, each drop sounding like a distant drumbeat. I stared out at the dark, the streetlights barely visible through the sheets of water. Seattle was always rainy, but tonight felt different. The storm had a certain weight to it, like it was pressing down on the old Victorian house, seeping into every crack and crevice. I tried to focus on the manuscript in front of me, but the words blurred together, meaningless on the page. My husband's absence made the house feel emptier, colder. I was alone, and the silence, except for the storm, was deafening. I closed the laptop, rubbing my eyes. The house creaked in response, the old wood shifting as it always did, but tonight those familiar sounds were unsettling. "It's just the wind," I muttered to myself, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow in the empty room. I glanced at the clock, past midnight. I should have gone to bed hours ago, but the storm kept me on edge. I wasn't ready to face the dark, not with the way the shadows seemed to stretch and grow, twisting into shapes that made my pulse quicken. A loud bang echoed through the house, making me jump. My heart raced, and I strained to listen. It was probably nothing, maybe a loose shutter or a tree branch blown against the house. But the sound had been so forceful, so deliberate. I bit my lip, debating whether to investigate. "It's nothing," I whispered, but my voice trembled. The house settled again, the floorboards groaning like they were carrying a heavy burden. I stood up, wrapping my arms around myself as I walked to the hallway. The light flickered, casting erratic shadows across the walls. I tried to convince myself that everything was fine, that I was just being paranoid. But the unease in my gut wouldn't go away. I made my way to the front door, where the sound had come from, and pressed my ear against it, holding my breath. Another bang, followed by a slow, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the porch. My skin prickled with fear, and I felt a cold sweat on my forehead. "Who's there?" I called out, the words leaving my mouth before I could stop them. Silence answered. I waited, each second stretching longer than the last. When nothing else happened, I slowly unlatched the door, peeking out through the small gap. The rain poured down in torrents, but there was no one there. I shivered, a mix of relief and lingering fear washing over me. I shut the door quickly, locking it with shaking hands. My mind raced, trying to explain away the noises. The storm could make anything sound strange. The wind, the rain, it all played tricks on you. But as I turned to head back to the living room, I heard it again. This time, it wasn't just a bang. It was a low, guttural scratching at the window, like nails dragging across the glass. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Something was out there, and it was trying to get in. The scratching at the window didn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent, like whatever was out there was desperate to get in. My pulse quickened, every instinct screaming at me to stay away, but my feet moved on their own. I crept toward the window, the sound grating on my nerves with each step. My fingers hovered over the curtain, hesitating. I didn't want to see what was on the other side, but I couldn't just ignore it. I swallowed hard and yanked the curtain aside. The glass was fogged with moisture, raindrops streaking down the pane, but through the blur, I saw movement, just a shadow, shifting and flickering. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to see more, but the storm obscured everything. I pressed my forehead against the cold glass, squinting into the night. Nothing. Just darkness and the relentless rain. "Get it together," I whispered, stepping back, my breath shaky. My mind raced through 100 possibilities. An animal, maybe? But what kind of animal scratches like that? And why at the window, so deliberately? I couldn't shake the feeling that it was something more, something worse. I turned away from the window, trying to push the thought from my mind, but the sound echoed in my ears, a constant reminder that I was not alone. The house groaned again, and this time, the noise seemed to come from all around me. My thoughts spiraled, every creak and crack suddenly filled with meaning. I forced myself to walk back to the living room, my eyes darting to every corner, every shadow. The air felt heavier, thick with tension. I tried to shake it off, to convince myself it was just the storm playing tricks, but it was no use. The fear clung to me, growing with each passing second. I grabbed my phone from the coffee table, fingers trembling as I dialed my husband's number. It rang, but he didn't pick up. I cursed under my breath, pacing the room, clutching the phone like it was a lifeline. I needed to hear his voice, to tell him what was happening, to feel like I wasn't completely alone in this. But all I got was his voicemail, that impersonal tone making me feel even more isolated. "Please call me back," I said, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. "I think someone's outside." I ended the call and stood there, staring at the phone, waiting for it to ring. The house creaked again, louder this time, as if something or someone was moving within the walls. I couldn't stand still any longer. I needed to check the doors, the windows, everything. I needed to make sure they were locked, that I was safe. But deep down, I knew that whatever was out there wasn't just trying to get in, it was already here. I moved through the house with quick, nervous steps, checking each lock, each window, as if I could somehow keep the fear at bay by securing the physical world around me. My hands shook as I double-checked the front door. It was locked, deadbolt in place. I pushed against it just to be sure, feeling the solid resistance, but the sense of security was fleeting, slipping away as soon as I turned my back. I went room to room, the dim light from the storm barely illuminating the old wood and faded wallpaper. Every corner seemed to hide something. Every shadow held a threat. The silence between the cracks and groans of the house was oppressive, a reminder that I was alone in a space that suddenly felt unfamiliar. I reached the back door, and as I tested the lock, I heard it, a low, almost imperceptible rustling, like something moving just beyond the thin barrier of the wall. My breath caught, and I froze, listening. The sound was faint, but unmistakable. It was deliberate, purposeful, not the random noise of the wind or the rain. I pressed my ear to the door, heart pounding, trying to make sense of it. The rustling stopped, replaced by a soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming lightly on the wood. My stomach twisted in knots, dread pooling in the pit of my stomach. It was out there, just inches away, separated only by the thin wooden door that suddenly felt far too fragile. I backed away slowly, refusing to take my eyes off the door, as if by watching it, I could somehow control what was happening. My mind raced, trying to find an explanation that made sense, but nothing did. This was wrong, all of it. The noises, the feeling of being watched, the storm amplifying every fear I had buried deep. "You're imagining things," I whispered to myself, but the words felt hollow, as empty as the dark spaces around me. In the hallway, I noticed something that stopped me cold, a faint set of scratches on the wall, just above the baseboard. They were fresh, too fresh, the paint still flaking at the edges. I reached out, fingers trembling, and traced the jagged marks. They were deep, as if something with claws had raked them across the plaster. My pulse quickened, panic setting in. This wasn't just outside, it was inside. It had been inside all along. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the rug, my mind reeling. What the hell was happening? My phone was still clutched in my hand, and I dialed 911 without thinking, desperate for a connection to the outside world, for help. But as I raised the phone to my ear, the screen flickered, the call failing before it could even connect. No, I muttered, hitting redial, but the phone went dark, the battery suddenly drained. The lights flickered, then went out completely, plunging the house into darkness. I was left standing in the pitch black, the silence pressing in on all sides. My breath came in short, panicked gasps, the darkness alive with every terrible possibility. And in that moment, I knew I wasn't alone. The darkness swallowed me whole. I couldn't see my hand in front of my face, but I could hear it, the faint sound of something moving, slow and deliberate. My breath hitched, fear tightening its grip around my chest. I strained to listen, every nerve on edge, but the house was deathly silent now, as if holding its breath along with me. My thoughts raced, each one more frantic than the last. I needed to move, to find some light, but my feet were glued to the floor, paralyzed by the terror that I wasn't alone. A soft creak came from the hallway, and I turned toward it, heart hammering. The air felt thick, suffocating, like it was alive with something malevolent. I forced myself to take a step, then another, groping blindly along the wall. My fingers brushed against cold plaster, then wood, and finally, the smooth surface of a flashlight I'd left on a side table. I snatched it up, fumbling with the switch, and for a terrifying second, it wouldn't turn on. Then, with a sputter, the beam cut through the darkness, casting eerie shadows that danced along the walls. The light offered little comfort. The hallway stretched out before me, each doorway a black void. I had to keep moving. My mind was a blur of panic and doubt. What was in here with me? The claw marks, the sounds, it was all too real. I couldn't deny it anymore. Something had breached the safety of my home, something that wasn't human. I tried to push the thought away, but it clung to me, refusing to let go. I moved cautiously down the hallway, the beam of the flashlight shaking in my hand. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but there was nowhere to go. My house, once a sanctuary, had become a trap, every room a potential hiding place for whatever lurked in the dark. I felt the presence before I saw it, a cold, oppressive force that seemed to press down on me, making it hard to breathe. I stopped, the flashlight's beam wavering as I tried to steady myself. Then, a whisper. Low, raspy, and close enough that I could feel the breath on my neck. "You can't hide." The words sent a jolt of terror through me, and I spun around, the flashlight flickering wildly. Nothing. Just empty air and the echo of those words, still ringing in my ears. I backed away, the light darting across the walls, searching for the source of the voice. My hands were slick with sweat, the flashlight slipping slightly in my grip. I wanted to scream, but the sound caught in my throat, a strangled gasp all I could manage. A floorboard creaked behind me, and I froze, every muscle locking up. The presence was closer now, its cold breath tickling the back of my neck. I could feel it, the sheer wrongness of it, like a void sucking the warmth from the air. I knew if I turned around, I would see it, whatever it was that had invaded my home, that had been watching me, waiting for this moment. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst, but I couldn't turn, couldn't face what was there. The darkness pressed in on me, and in that suffocating moment, I realized there was no escape. It had found me. I couldn't breathe. My lungs felt like they were collapsing under the weight of the darkness, every breath a struggle. I wanted to move, to run, but I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by a terror so deep it felt like it had fused with my bones. The whisper echoed in my mind, relentless, wrapping around my thoughts like a vice. "You can't hide." The words reverberated through me, more than just a threat. They were a promise. I forced myself to take a step, then another, inching away from the spot where I knew it was standing, just out of sight. My legs trembled, barely supporting me as I moved down the hallway. The flashlight flickered, casting jittery, frantic shadows on the walls, every one a possible shape of the thing that hunted me. I couldn't tell if it was still behind me, but I could feel its presence, like a cold breath on the back of my neck, sending shivers down my spine. I reached the stairs and hesitated. The basement. It was the last place I wanted to go, but the thought of staying on this floor, with that thing so close, was unbearable. I took a deep breath and started down, each step creaking underfoot, the noise deafening in the stillness. I held the flashlight out in front of me, its weak beam cutting through the thick shadows as I descended into the depths of the house. The basement smelled of damp earth and something else, something foul that made my stomach churn. I reached the bottom and swept the flashlight around the room, the dim light revealing old boxes, broken furniture, and a door I didn't recognize. My pulse quickened. I'd lived in this house for years and had never seen that door before. It was ancient, the wood dark with age, and something about it felt wrong, like it didn't belong here. I couldn't look away, my gaze drawn to the rusty handle, to the way the wood seemed to pulse, almost like it was breathing. I knew I shouldn't, but my hand reached for the handle, fingers trembling as they wrapped around the cold metal. The door creaked open with a sound that made my skin crawl, revealing a narrow, pitch-black hallway beyond. The stench intensified, a wave of rot and decay that nearly brought me to my knees. I should have turned back, slammed the door shut and run, but something compelled me forward, pulling me into that dark, suffocating tunnel. I took a step inside, then another, the air thick and heavy, almost solid. My heart pounded in my chest, every instinct screaming at me to stop, to turn back. But I couldn't. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, the walls closing in as I moved deeper into the darkness. Then I heard it again, That whisper. Only this time it was all around me, echoing off the walls, burrowing into my skull. "You can't hide." I stumbled, catching myself against the wall, my hand pressing into something wet and sticky. The flashlight flickered, the beam struggling against the darkness, and then I saw it. A figure at the end of the hallway, barely visible in the weak light. It was tall, unnaturally so, its limbs long and thin, fingers ending in sharp, twisted claws. It didn't move, just stood there, watching me with eyes that burned like embers in the dark. My breath hitched, terror flooding my veins. Suddenly the figure spoke, its voice a raspy, guttural whisper that made my skin crawl. "I've been waiting for you." The realization hit me like a freight train, knocking the breath from my lungs. This wasn't a random haunting. It had been waiting for me, specifically me, all along. The house, the whispers, the darkness, it had all been a trap, and I had walked right into it. My blood ran cold as the truth settled in. There was no escape, no way out. It had me, just like it had all the others before. And now it was my turn. The flashlight flickered once more and died, plunging me into total darkness. The last thing I heard before everything went black was its voice, low and final, sealing my fate. "Welcome home." The night always felt heavier in my apartment, like the walls were closing in just a little tighter after the sun went down. I'd grown used to the dim lighting, the way the shadows stretched long and thin across the floor. But tonight something was different. The air felt thicker, almost suffocating. I tried to focus on my painting, but my mind kept drifting to the basement. That damn basement. I've never been down there. No one has, as far as I know. The door's always locked, the kind of lock that looks like it's been rusted shut for years. But lately, I've been hearing things. At first, I thought it was just the old pipes groaning, or maybe the building settling. This place is ancient, after all. But the noises have become more frequent, harder to ignore. It's like a low rumble, almost like something's moving beneath the floor, shifting in the darkness. Sometimes, late at night when everything else is quiet, I swear I can hear voices. Not clear enough to make out any words, but there's a rhythm to them, a cadence that doesn't belong to anything natural. I tried to brush it off, tell myself it was just my imagination running wild. But the more I ignored it, the louder it got, like whatever was down there wanted to be heard. I could feel it gnawing at the edge of my thoughts, distracting me from my work. My brush hovered over the canvas, the colors blurring together, shapes losing their form. Frustrated, I threw the brush down, smearing a line of red across the painting. "Get a grip, Peter," I muttered to myself, rubbing my eyes with the back of my hand. But even as I said it, I knew it wouldn't help. The feeling of unease was too strong, a cold knot in my stomach that wouldn't go away. I glanced at the clock. It was nearly midnight, the city outside unusually quiet, as if the whole world was holding its breath. I got up and walked to the window, looking out at the street below. Nothing. No cars, no people, just the empty sidewalk stretching out under the flickering streetlights. My reflection stared back at me from the glass, pale and tired. I turned away, trying to shake off the sense of dread that had settled over me like a heavy blanket. But the noise came again, louder this time, a scraping sound that sent a shiver down my spine. I stood there, heart pounding, debating whether to ignore it or finally face whatever was making that noise. My curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a flashlight from the drawer, the cold metal reassuring in my hand. As I headed toward the door, a part of me screamed to stop, to just leave it alone. But another part, the part that couldn't stand not knowing, pushed me forward. I had to see what was down there. The hallway outside my apartment felt colder than usual, the air heavy with the scent of dust and something else, something damp and old. My footsteps echoed louder than they should have, the sound bouncing off the narrow walls. I hesitated at the top of the stairs, staring down into the darkness that swallowed the bottom half of the spiral. The basement door was just beyond those steps, hidden in the shadows like a secret I wasn't supposed to uncover. I gripped the flashlight tighter, the metal digging into my palm, and forced myself to take the first step. The stairs creaked under my weight, each groan sending a jolt of tension through me. I focused on the beam of light cutting through the darkness, trying to steady my breathing. The deeper I went, the more I could feel that uneasy knot in my stomach twisting tighter. It wasn't just fear, it was like the air itself was warning me to turn back. But I couldn't stop now. The noises were clearer, more distinct. I could hear the scraping again, like something heavy was being dragged across the floor. And underneath that, the murmur of voices, still too faint to make out, but unmistakably human. Or at least, they sounded human. My heart pounded in my chest, but I kept moving, kept descending into that cold, stale darkness. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, the basement door loomed in front of me, larger than I remembered. The lock was rusted, but the door itself looked solid, almost new. It didn't belong in this old building, not with its smooth surface and the way it seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. My hand shook as I reached for the doorknob, the cold metal sending a shock through my skin. I half expected the door to be stuck, but it swung open easily, almost too easily. The hinges didn't creak, didn't make a sound, as if the door had been waiting for someone to open it. Beyond the threshold, the basement stretched out before me, only it wasn't the basement I remembered. The space was vast, impossibly large for a building this size. The walls were lined with strange mechanical contraptions, covered in dust but still humming with a faint, unsettling energy. As I stepped inside, the voices grew louder, more insistent, though I still couldn't make out the words. The floor beneath my feet felt uneven, almost soft, like I was walking on something that wasn't quite solid. I swept the flashlight across the room, catching glimpses of movement in the corners of my vision, shadows that flickered and danced just out of reach. I couldn't tell if they were real or just tricks of the light, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. "Hello?" My voice came out hoarse, barely above a whisper. The sound seemed to disappear into the vastness swallowed by the dark. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of oil and something else, something sweet, almost cloying. I took another step, my foot sinking slightly into the floor, and that's when I realized I wasn't alone down here. I stood frozen, my breath caught in my throat. The realization that I wasn't alone down here hit me like a punch to the gut. I strained to listen, but all I could hear was the pounding of my own heart, the rapid, shallow breaths that seemed too loud in the suffocating quiet. The shadows danced just outside the beam of my flashlight, twisting and curling like smoke, but I couldn't tell if they were moving on their own or if it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I had to move, had to do something, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. The floor beneath me was soft, almost yielding, like I was standing on wet clay. I didn't want to look down, didn't want to know what I was really standing on. But the smell, that sickly sweet scent, was getting stronger, and it was coming from the floor. I forced myself to take a step, and the ground squelched underfoot, sending a wave of nausea rolling through me. "Who's there?" I called out, hating how small and weak my voice sounded. The words echoed back at me, distorted like they'd been dragged through mud. No answer, just that endless, oppressive silence. I felt like the room was shrinking, closing in around me, the walls pressing closer with every breath I took. The machinery hummed louder now, almost a vibration in the air, like it was waking up, responding to my presence. I took another step, the flashlight trembling in my hand as I scanned the room. The shadows clung to the edges of the light, retreating just enough to stay out of sight, but I could feel them watching. I could feel something watching. The whispers grew louder, filling my ears with a rush of disjointed words, half-formed sentences that made no sense. They swirled around me, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once, and I pressed my hands to my ears, trying to block them out, but it was useless. The ground shifted under me again, and this time I did look down. The floor was slick, not with water, but with something thicker, something dark and glistening in the faint light. My stomach turned as the smell hit me full force, and I had to swallow hard to keep from gagging. It wasn't clay or dirt I was standing on. It was flesh, rotting, decayed, pulsating as if it were alive. I stumbled back, my foot catching on something soft and yielding, and I fell hard, the flashlight skittering across the floor, plunging me into darkness. Panic surged through me. I scrambled to my feet, the whispers now a cacophony of voices screaming in my head. I couldn't see, couldn't breathe, the dark pressing in on me from all sides. My hands fumbled for the flashlight, fingers brushing against something cold and wet, but I didn't dare think about what it was. I found the flashlight, its beam flickering weakly as I shone it around, desperate for a way out. But the room had changed, twisted, warped. The door was gone. The staircase, gone. Only the shadows remained, growing thicker, more solid, taking shape before my eyes. I could barely hold the flashlight steady as the shadows around me started to take form. They weren't just shapes anymore. They had substance, a creeping solidity that made my skin crawl. I backed away, but there was nowhere to go, no way out. The room was alive, shifting, changing with every breath I took. The walls seemed to pulse, a sickening rhythm that matched the pounding in my chest. "Please," I whispered, though I didn't know who or what I was pleading with. The voices, those terrible, disjointed whispers, seemed to laugh at my fear, mocking me as they grew louder, more insistent. They were in my head now, filling every corner of my mind with their relentless chatter. I couldn't think, couldn't focus on anything but the growing dread that was swallowing me whole. The shadows were closer now, so close I could feel the cold radiating off them. They moved with a slow, deliberate purpose, as if they had all the time in the world to reach me. My back hit something solid, a wall, or what used to be a wall, and I felt the panic rise in my throat. Trapped. I was trapped down here, with these things, and there was no escape. No door, no stairs, just the endless dark, closing in on me from all sides. "Get out of my head!" I screamed, clutching at my temples as the whispers grew into a deafening roar. But the more I fought, the deeper they dug in, twisting my thoughts, my memories, into something alien, something wrong. They were searching, sifting through everything I was, everything I had ever been, and tearing it apart, piece by piece. I dropped the flashlight. It clattered to the ground, the beam flickering once before dying out completely. The darkness rushed in, swallowing the last bit of light, and I was left with nothing but the shadows and the cold. The air grew thicker, harder to breathe, as if the room itself was closing in on me. I could feel something in the darkness, something more than just the shadows, something that was waiting, watching, enjoying the fear it was pulling from me. Then, suddenly, the voices stopped. The silence was absolute, oppressive. I didn't trust it, couldn't trust it, but the relief was overwhelming. My breath came in ragged gasps, the only sound in the suffocating dark. But that relief was short-lived. As my eyes adjusted to the blackness, I realized I wasn't alone. The shadows had solidified, taken shape, and they were all around me, their eyes glowing faintly in the dark, like embers waiting to ignite. They didn't move, just stood there, staring, as if they were waiting for something. My mind raced, trying to understand, to find some way out of this nightmare. But there was nothing, no escape, no explanation. Just the cold, the dark, and the awful gnawing certainty that whatever was down here with me had been waiting a long, long time for someone to find them. And now that they had, they weren't going to let me go. The silence pressed down on me, so thick it felt like it was choking the air out of my lungs. I couldn't see them anymore, the shadows, but I knew they were there, surrounding me, waiting for something. My hands were trembling, fingers numb from the cold, but I forced myself to move, to inch along the wall behind me. I needed to find something solid, something real, to anchor myself in this nightmare. I reached out, my hand brushing against the wall's surface. It felt wrong, smooth, almost soft, like flesh stretched too tight over bone. I jerked my hand back, bile rising in my throat, but there was nowhere else to go. The walls were closing in, the space around me shrinking with every shallow breath I took. Then, from the darkness, a voice. Not a whisper this time, but clear, sharp, cutting through the silence like a knife. "You shouldn't have come here, Peter." It wasn't one of the shadowy figures speaking. It was my voice. I froze, blood turning to ice in my veins as the words sank in. The tone, the cadence, it was unmistakable. It was me, or something that sounded exactly like me. Who are you?" My voice cracked, weak and trembling, but it echoed in the darkness, bouncing back at me in distorted fragments. The air grew colder, the darkness thicker, wrapping around me like a shroud. I could feel it pressing against my skin, seeping into my mind, into my thoughts, as if it were searching for something. The answer came not in words, but in a surge of memories, my memories. Images flashed before my eyes, me as a child, standing in front of a mirror, me painting in my studio, alone for hours on end. me staring into the darkness of my apartment late at night, feeling that same gnawing unease. But these weren't just memories. They were twisted, warped, as if someone had reached into my mind and bent them to their will. "No," I whispered, shaking my head, trying to clear the fog that had settled over my thoughts. But the images kept coming, faster now, more distorted, until they were all I could see. My life, my identity, unraveling before me, piece by piece, and in the center of it all, something dark, something that had been there all along, waiting for the right moment to surface. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The shadows weren't just in this basement. They'd been with me my whole life, lurking in the corners of my mind, feeding on my fears, my doubts. They had been watching, waiting for me to find this place, to find them, so they could finally take control. The voice spoke again, closer this time, almost inside my head. "You belong to us now, Peter. You always have." The last bit of light faded, swallowed by the dark, and I felt something cold wrap around my wrist, pulling me deeper into the void. I tried to fight, tried to hold on to who I was, but it was like trying to hold water in my hands. Everything slipped through my fingers, lost to the dark. As I was dragged down, the final, horrifying truth hit me. The basement, the shadows, the voices, they weren't just in this building. They were inside me, part of me, and they had been all along. I hadn't found them. They had led me here, guided me to this moment. And now that they had me, there was no escape. I was theirs, and there was nothing left of me but the darkness. I was looking for some quiet, a place where I could finally concentrate on my thesis without the constant noise of campus life. That's why I chose the old house in the middle of nowhere, far enough from distractions. I should have known the isolation would come with its own problems. The house was just as I remembered from my childhood, dusty, creaky, and filled with that odd smell of old wood. It had been in my family for generations, a relic from a time I wasn't sure I wanted to understand. The place was eerie, but I brushed it off, telling myself it was just the years of silence hanging in the air. "It's just an old house, Emily," I muttered under my breath. "Nothing to be scared of." On the first day, I started exploring, more out of habit than anything else. The attic was the last place I went. It was cramped, filled with boxes that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. That's where I found it, the mirror, hidden under a dusty sheet. It was large, almost as tall as me, with an ornate, weathered frame. Something about it felt wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on it. Maybe it was the way the light caught the glass, distorting my reflection, or maybe it was just the unsettling quiet of the attic. Still, I uncovered it, wiping away the dust with my sleeve. I almost expected the mirror to be cracked, but the glass was pristine. Just a mirror, I told myself again. But then, something strange happened. As I looked at my reflection, I noticed a flicker of movement behind me, a shadow that shouldn't have been there. I turned around quickly, my heart pounding in my chest, but there was nothing. Just old boxes and shadows cast by the dim attic light. "Get a grip, Emily," I whispered, but the unease didn't go away. I carried on with my day, trying to shake the feeling that the mirror's reflection had shown me something more than just my own image. It was silly, irrational even, to think that a simple mirror could be anything more than glass and wood. Yet the thought lingered, creeping into my mind whenever I let my guard down. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every groan of the old floorboards sent my imagination spiraling. I kept seeing that shadow in the mirror's reflection, over and over, like a bad dream I couldn't wake up from. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just a trick of the light or my tired mind playing games with me. But deep down, I knew there was something more, something I couldn't explain. After finding the mirror in the attic, I wasn't sure what to expect, but I wasn't ready for what happened next. I thought it was just an old, dusty piece of glass, nothing more. I should have left it covered, forgotten, but curiosity got the better of me. I pulled the cloth off, revealing its tarnished surface. At first, everything seemed normal, just my reflection staring back at me, but something felt off. The room behind me in the reflection was a little darker, a little more distorted than it should have been. I blinked, trying to clear my head, but the strange feeling only grew stronger. I tried to laugh it off, chalking it up to my imagination. After all, it was an old house, creaky and filled with shadows that played tricks on the eyes. I went back downstairs, leaving the mirror behind, but I couldn't shake the unease that had settled in the pit of my stomach. I made some tea, hoping the warmth would calm me down, but every little sound seemed louder than it should have been. The ticking of the clock, the creak of the floorboards. It was like the house was holding its breath, waiting for something. As I sat there, I found myself glancing up at the ceiling, imagining the mirror just sitting up there, waiting for me. I told myself it was ridiculous, but the urge to go back up there grew stronger. Finally, I gave in. I went back to the attic, my steps slow, each one echoing through the empty house. The mirror stood there, silent, as if it had never been touched. But when I looked into it again, I saw something, or someone, standing behind me. I spun around, but the attic was empty. My heart was racing now, my breath coming in short gasps. I looked back at the mirror, and there it was again, a shadowy figure, just barely visible in the dim light. It didn't move, just stood there watching me. I stepped closer, my hand trembling as I reached out to touch the glass. My fingers brushed the surface, and the coldness of it sent a shiver down my spine. The figure was gone, but the feeling of being watched lingered. I tried to tell myself it was just a trick of the light, that I was imagining things, but I knew better. I couldn't explain it, but something about that mirror wasn't right. I decided to cover it back up, but as I moved to do so, I saw my reflection again. This time, though, my face looked different, paler, almost ghostly, and my eyes, they didn't look like my eyes. They were cold, empty, like I was staring at a stranger. I backed away, feeling a growing sense of dread. I needed to get out of there, away from that mirror, but my feet felt like they were stuck to the floor. I was trapped, unable to look away from the twisted version of myself staring back at me. Finally, I forced myself to move, turning and rushing out of the attic, slamming the door behind me. But even then, I could feel it. Whatever was in that mirror was still watching me, waiting for the moment when it could break free. As the night grew colder, the unease I'd felt earlier only intensified. I couldn't shake the thought of that strange reflection. It wasn't just some trick of the light or my mind playing games with me. It felt more deliberate, like something was watching, waiting for the right moment to make itself known. My hands were shaking as I lit the small lamp beside the bed, hoping its warm glow would offer some comfort. It didn't. I kept telling myself it was just a mirror, an old piece of glass with a frame that had seen better days. But the more I tried to rationalize it, the more I realized how foolish that sounded. Something about it was wrong, very wrong. The room was filled with a strange tension, thick and heavy, as if the air itself was pressing down on me. I could feel it creeping into my thoughts, making me doubt everything I knew. Every sound seemed amplified, the creaking of the floorboards, the rustle of the curtains, even the distant howl of the wind outside. My heart was pounding in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears. I needed to see the mirror again, to prove to myself that it was just my imagination. But the thought of facing whatever I saw earlier made my stomach turn. What if it wasn't just a trick of the light? I finally forced myself to stand, my legs trembling as I walked back to the attic. The door creaked open, revealing the dark space that now felt more like a trap than a storage room. The mirror stood exactly where I'd left it, covered once again by the cloth. I hesitated, my fingers grazing the edge of the fabric, the coldness seeping into my skin. I needed to see it again, to know if I was losing my mind. With a deep breath, I yanked the cloth away, my eyes immediately locking onto the glass. The reflection was the same, but this time, there was something else. A shadow, faint but unmistakable, moved behind me. My breath caught in my throat as I spun around, only to find the attic empty. But when I looked back at the mirror, the shadow was gone. No movement, no figure, just my pale face staring back at me. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over a box. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be. But the fear was real, gnawing at the edges of my sanity. I could feel it, something lurking just out of sight, waiting for me to make a mistake. The reflection wasn't just showing what was there, it was showing what could be, what might be if I wasn't careful. And in that moment, I knew the mirror wasn't just a piece of old glass. It was a doorway, and something was trying to cross through. The hours seemed to stretch endlessly as I wandered through the house, unable to find any reprieve from the growing dread. Every room felt like it was closing in on me, the walls seeming to pulse with a sinister rhythm. I tried to distract myself, flipping through the old books I'd found in the attic, but the words on the pages blurred together, offering no comfort. I kept returning to the mirror, unable to resist its pull. Every time I looked, the reflections seemed more intense, more desperate. I could swear I saw shapes moving just out of view, figures pressing against the glass, trying to reach through. I tried talking to myself, convincing myself it was just shadows and my imagination. "It's just a mirror," I told myself, but the words sounded hollow, even to me. Then came the whispers. They started as faint, almost imperceptible, but they grew louder as the night deepened. I couldn't make out the words, but they were unmistakably there, low, guttural, and filled with an eerie sense of urgency. I pressed my ear against the mirror, hoping to catch something more concrete, but all I heard was my own shallow breathing. My reflection, however, was different. The figure in the glass seemed to move on its own, independent of my own movements. It was like watching a ghostly dance, a macabre performance with no music. I tried to focus, my eyes straining against the dark, but the more I looked, the more distorted and nightmarish the reflection became. Faces pressed against the glass, mouths open in silent screams, their eyes pleading for something I couldn't understand. A sudden sound, a loud thud, made me jump. It came from downstairs, followed by a series of rapid, rhythmic bangs. My heart raced as I crept toward the noise, each step echoing through the empty house. I wanted to call out, to ask if anyone else was there, but my voice caught in my throat. I felt like a fool, like I was chasing shadows in the dark. When I reached the source of the noise, I found nothing but the silence of the empty living room. The furniture was exactly where I'd left it. No sign of disturbance, no sign of any intruder. Yet the feeling of being watched, of something lurking just beyond my sight, was stronger than ever. I knew the mirror was more than just glass. It was a portal, a gateway to something I couldn't begin to understand. And I was its captive audience, trapped in a nightmare that was just beginning to unfold. The oppressive quiet seemed to settle deeper as the hours ticked by. I was standing in front of the mirror again, the only source of light in the darkened attic. My reflection was no longer just a distorted version of myself. It had taken on a new form, an otherworldly version of me, pale and twisted, with eyes that seemed to bore into my soul. I tried to step back, but the mirror seemed to pull me closer. My pulse pounded in my ears. The figures I'd seen before were now more distinct, their features etched in horrifying clarity. One figure stood out, a gaunt, skeletal face with eyes like black voids, watching me intently. It reached out from the glass, its fingers inching closer to the surface, as if trying to cross over. I pressed my back against the wall, my breathing ragged. I was losing track of time, of reality. The whispers grew louder, swirling around me like a storm of voices. "You have to understand," a voice hissed from the mirror, barely more than a breath. "It's not just a mirror, it's a prison." The room seemed to spin, the shadows elongating and shifting with a life of their own. I saw my own reflection standing in front of me, but it wasn't me. It was the reflection that had always seemed to move independently, now smiling cruelly. I could barely think straight. My mind raced through every possible explanation, but none made sense. "What do you want from me?" I finally shouted, my voice cracking with desperation. A sudden coldness wrapped around me, squeezing the breath from my lungs. I turned to see the attic door swinging open, revealing the dark staircase leading down to the rest of the house. The cold seeped through my clothes, through my skin, and into my bones. I was frozen, my feet planted in place as if the floor had turned to ice. Then I saw it, a figure emerging from the darkness of the staircase, its form barely visible but unmistakably human. It moved slowly, deliberately, and as it came closer, I recognized the face. It was me. Or rather, it was a version of me I'd never seen before, my features twisted with a malevolent grin. The figure spoke in a voice that was eerily familiar, yet distorted. "You were always meant to be here," it said. "You've finally come home." I felt a wave of terror wash over me. I realized that the mirror wasn't just reflecting my fears. It was a window into a reality where I was trapped, and the reflection in the mirror was not a mere image, it was a gateway to something far more sinister. The realization hit me hard. I was never meant to leave. I had become part of the mirror's twisted reality, and the true horror was that I was now a part of the darkness I had feared. As I stood in the middle of the old train station, the smell of dust and rust filled my nose. The place was a relic, forgotten by time, and in desperate need of repair. The wooden beams creaked above me, and the faded paint on the walls peeled away like dead skin. This station had seen better days, but tonight it was all mine. I had always loved the quiet, the isolation that came with working late hours. There was something about being alone in a place like this that made me feel connected to the past. I set my tools down on a nearby bench, listening to the wind howl through the broken windows. The sound was unsettling, but I shrugged it off. Just the wind, I told myself, nothing to worry about. I grabbed a wrench and started tightening bolts on the old tracks, focusing on the rhythmic clinking of metal against metal. It was easy to lose myself in the work, to forget the strange feeling that had settled in the pit of my stomach. After a while, I heard something that made me stop in my tracks. It was faint at first, barely audible over the wind. A distant whistle, low and haunting, like a ghost from another time. I looked up, my heart pounding in my chest. The tracks had been abandoned for years. No trains had run on them since before I was born. I shook my head, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. But the sound came again, this time louder, closer. I dropped the wrench, my hands suddenly slick with sweat. "No way," I whispered, glancing at the door. I wanted to go outside to see if there was something out there, but my legs wouldn't move. The whistle echoed again, and with it came the unmistakable sound of wheels grinding against the tracks. I could feel the vibration beneath my feet, the cold iron resonating with a life of its own. A shiver ran down my spine as the temperature in the room plummeted. The warm, stuffy air was replaced by an icy chill that seeped into my bones. I rubbed my arms, trying to ward off the cold, but it was no use. The whistle blared once more, this time so close it seemed to be right outside the station. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to breathe. "It's just the wind," I muttered, though I didn't believe it. Something was out there, something that wasn't supposed to be. I finally mustered the courage to move, stumbling toward the door with shaky legs. As I reached for the handle, the door swung open on its own, revealing the dark, foggy night beyond. The station was empty, the tracks silent, but the cold lingered, wrapping around me like a death grip. I took a step outside, my breath fogging in the air. The night was still, eerily so, and the tracks stretched out into the darkness, disappearing into the mist. There was nothing there, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting for me to let my guard down. I stood in the doorway, the cold night air pressing in on me. My breath hung in the air like a ghost, swirling in the fog. I strained my ears, listening for any sound, any sign that I wasn't alone. But there was only silence. The tracks stretched out, vanishing into the darkness, and for a moment I felt foolish. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, the isolation getting to me. I laughed nervously, the sound echoing in the emptiness. "Come on, Mark, get a grip," I whispered, trying to shake off the lingering unease. But then, there it was again, a low, mournful whistle that seemed to rise up from the ground beneath my feet. This time, it was unmistakable. My heart pounded as I turned my head, searching for the source. The sound was coming from the direction of the tracks, from the mist that clung to them like a shroud. The whistle grew louder, more insistent, and with it came the rumble of wheels on iron. I could feel it now, the vibrations creeping up through the soles of my boots, rattling my bones. "No, this isn't possible," I muttered, stepping back into the station. The temperature had dropped even further, and I could see my breath with each exhale. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. The tracks were supposed to be dead, unused for years. Yet the sound of an approaching train was undeniable. I backed away from the door, my legs trembling as I stumbled into the main hall. The station had changed. The shadows seemed to have thickened, the corners of the room darker than before. The air was heavy, charged with something I couldn't quite grasp. I felt like I was being watched, like 1,000 unseen eyes were on me, waiting. I swallowed hard, trying to calm the panic rising in my chest. Just get through the night, I told myself, but the words offered no comfort. The train, whatever it was coming, and I wasn't sure I wanted to be here when it arrived. I moved to the window, peering out into the fog. The tracks were still empty, but the sound was growing louder, filling the air with a metallic screech that set my teeth on edge. I could feel it now, that cold dread creeping up my spine, wrapping around my throat. The station felt like a tomb, cold and unyielding, and I was trapped inside. I turned away from the window, my pulse racing, and started pacing the room, my footsteps echoing off the walls. My thoughts spiraled. What if this wasn't just a trick of the mind? What if something was truly out there? Something that shouldn't be? I couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a sound in the night. It felt like the station itself was alive, waiting for the train to arrive, like it had been waiting all these years. The thought chilled me to the bone, and I stopped in my tracks, staring at the door as if it might burst open at any moment. I knew I should leave, get out of there while I still could. But some twisted part of me was rooted in place, desperate to see what would happen next. The fear was paralyzing, but it was also intoxicating, a dark curiosity that gnawed at my mind. I clenched my fists, trying to steady my breathing. I could hear it now, the unmistakable sound of the train, closer than ever. I had to make a choice, run or face whatever was coming. The decision weighed on me, and I wasn't sure which terrified me more. The distant rumble grew louder, an insistent force that seemed to vibrate through my bones. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but the sensation was too vivid, too real. I could feel the cold seeping through the walls, the chill of the night air mixing with a deeper, more unnatural frost. I shivered uncontrollably, the warmth from the old heater seeming to fade. I reached for my flashlight, the beam slicing through the thickening darkness of the station. The shadows danced along the walls as I moved, stretching and twisting in grotesque shapes. Each creak of the floorboards felt amplified, echoing ominously. I shone the light toward the tracks, but the fog obscured everything beyond the glass, making the outside world seem like an abyss. "What is this?" I muttered to myself, my voice barely breaking through the growing noise. I felt like I was caught in a nightmare, each sound and shadow a part of a twisted reality I couldn't escape. I had always prided myself on being practical, grounded, but nothing about this made sense. My rational mind struggled to hold on, fighting the panic that threatened to overwhelm me. I heard the train whistle again, closer this time, and the sound was filled with a mournful quality that made my skin crawl. I could almost see it in my mind, a ghostly train cutting through the fog, its ancient wheels grinding against the iron tracks. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like lead. Instead, I forced myself to move, stumbling toward the control room. There had to be a logical explanation, a mechanical fault or a trick of the acoustics. As I approached the control room, the temperature dropped sharply. My breath came out in visible puffs, and I could see the frost forming on the window panes. I fumbled with the controls, trying to make sense of the situation. My fingers were numb, and I cursed under my breath as I struggled to keep the flashlight steady. The train's presence was undeniable now. I could feel it in the vibrating walls, the floor shaking with each distant rumble. Suddenly, the door to the control room slammed shut, and I was plunged into near darkness. I stumbled back, my heart racing as I fumbled with the door handle. Come on," I whispered frantically, pulling at the handle with all my strength. But it wouldn't budge. I was trapped. Panic clawed at my chest, and I took deep breaths, trying to keep my mind clear. "Think, Mark, think," I urged myself. I had to find a way out before whatever was coming reached me. Through the small window in the control room, I could see the ghostly outline of the train emerging from the fog. Its headlights cut through the mist like piercing eyes, illuminating the station with an eerie, cold glow. The whistle sounded again, closer, and I knew I had to act fast. With one last glance at the encroaching train, I grabbed my flashlight and started banging on the door, hoping against hope that someone, anyone, would hear me before it was too late. The door to the control room remained stubbornly shut, despite my frantic efforts to force it open. My flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows on the walls, each flash revealing the creeping frost that had overtaken the room. I could hear the train's whistle echoing in the distance, a mournful sound that seemed to seep into my very bones. I pounded on the door with both fists, my knuckles stinging from the impact. "Help! Somebody, please!" My voice was raw, barely audible over the relentless noise outside. Each second felt like an eternity. The cold was intense now, my breath forming dense clouds in the icy air. My mind raced through possible escape plans, but every idea seemed more desperate than the last. I glanced at the window, hoping for a sign of rescue or a way to signal someone outside. The fog had thickened, wrapping the station in a suffocating embrace. The ghostly light of the train seemed to pierce through the fog like a searching beacon. Its presence was growing stronger, filling the station with a low, rumbling vibration that made my teeth chatter. As the train's headlights swept across the station, I caught a glimpse of the passengers through the foggy window. Their faces were pale and ghostly, their expressions frozen in an eerie, silent scream. Panic surged through me. These weren't ordinary passengers. They were trapped, their eyes empty and lost, staring through the glass as if pleading for help. I turned back to the door, desperation clawing at my chest. "This can't be happening," I muttered, trying to steady my shaking hands. I needed to get out, to understand what was happening. I considered using my flashlight to break the window, but the glass seemed too thick, and the thought of getting trapped in the freezing night kept me from acting. Suddenly, the temperature in the control room dropped even further. I could see my breath in freezing puffs, the frost on the windows thickening. The train's whistle sounded again, louder and more insistent. I could hear the screech of the wheels against the tracks, a sound that sent chills down my spine. I knew I was running out of time. I turned my attention back to the door, taking a deep breath and bracing myself for one final attempt. "Come on, Mark, think," I told myself. I needed a plan, something to get me out of this nightmare. I needed to figure out what this train wanted and why it was here. With one last surge of adrenaline, I slammed my shoulder against the door, the wood groaning in protest. The door creaked open slightly, and I pushed with all my strength, finally breaking free. As I stumbled out into the station, I felt a rush of cold air and the ghostly presence of the train pressing closer. The spectral passengers were now clearly visible, their faces a disturbing mix of sorrow and terror. I had to find answers, but first I had to survive whatever was about to unfold. With the icy wind howling around me, I made my way toward the platform, determined to confront the source of the train's haunting call before it was too late. I stumbled onto the platform, my breath visible in the frigid air. The train's whistle pierced the night, its sound a cruel reminder of the danger that loomed. The spectral passengers remained in their seats, their hollow eyes following my every move with an unsettling intensity. The train had slowed to a crawl, its motion as unnatural as its passengers. I approached the edge of the platform, where the train's headlamp cast an eerie glow. The closer I got, the colder the air became, as if the train itself was drawing all warmth into its chilling embrace. Each step felt like a step deeper into an icy void. My mind raced with theories about what was happening, but none of them made sense. I felt like I was standing at the precipice of something both ancient and malevolent. Through the train's window, I saw a man at the conductor's seat. His figure was gaunt, with hollow cheeks and a vacant stare that seemed to penetrate through me. His uniform was old-fashioned, and he looked out of place, as though he had stepped out of another era. I hesitated, but something about his presence compelled me to move closer. Suddenly, the train's door opened with a creak that echoed in the empty station. The cold air rushed out, and I could see the faint outline of the interior. A voice called out from within the train, a chilling whisper that sent shivers down my spine. "Mark, come aboard." The voice was faint, almost drowned out by the howling wind, but it carried a sense of urgent despair. I fought against my own fear, realizing that I had to confront whatever was on this train. I stepped inside, the temperature plummeting further. The interior was like stepping back in time. The seats were worn, the decor outdated. The air was thick with an oppressive silence. The spectral passengers turned their heads slowly, their expressions a mix of sadness and pleading. As I moved down the aisle, the whispers grew louder. They were no longer just words, they were a chorus of torment. Each passenger seemed to reach out, their ghostly hands grasping at nothing. I approached the conductor, who remained seated, his eyes locked on me with an intensity that felt like a physical weight. When I finally reached him, I saw that his eyes were filled with tears. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice cracking. "I couldn't save them. They're trapped here because of me." The conductor's words made no sense, yet there was an undeniable truth in his sorrow. "Who's trapped?" I demanded, my voice trembling. "Why are they here?" The conductor pointed to a framed photograph on the wall behind him. It was an old image of the station, but what struck me was the date, 1923. The photograph showed a train with passengers, all of them looking eerily familiar. "This train, it never reached its destination," the conductor explained. "It vanished into the night, and so did the passengers. We're bound to this place, unable to move on." My heart sank as I realized the horrifying truth. The passengers were souls lost to time, and the train was a vessel for their eternal torment. The storm outside had awakened their plight, and I had become part of their endless journey. I needed to escape before the same fate befell me. I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing in the emptiness of the station. As I fled back to the platform, the train's whistle blared one last time, a mournful sound that seemed to follow me. I made it outside, the storm battering me as I sprinted for safety. Looking back, I saw the train slowly fading into the fog, its ghostly passengers watching with eyes that would never close. The station fell silent once more, but the chilling realization remained with me. The train would return, and I might not be so lucky next time. The evening was quiet when I decided to tackle the garage. The kind of quiet that only amplifies the smallest sounds, the scurrying of a mouse, the creak of an old floorboard. I had just moved into the house a few days ago and had barely scratched the surface of the mess left behind by the previous owner. The garage was a maze of dust-covered boxes and cobweb-laden furniture. I was eager to clear out the clutter and make the space my own. As I worked my way through the chaos, I stumbled upon a stack of boxes shoved in the corner. They were covered in a thick layer of dust, as if they had been forgotten for years. I dragged them into the middle of the room and, with a grunt, pried open the first box. Inside were old books, a faded blanket, and some framed photographs. Nothing too exciting. It was when I opened the second box that I found something intriguing, an old camcorder. It was heavy and caked with grime, but something about it caught my eye. I wiped it off and saw that the tape was still inside. Curiosity got the better of me, so I set up the camcorder in my living room, plugged it in, and pressed play. The screen flickered to life, and I was greeted by the shaky image of a man I assumed to be the previous owner. He was pacing back and forth, his face haggard and his eyes darting around as if he were expecting something to jump out at him. His words were frantic, almost pleading. "You have to prepare. It's coming. They're coming." The footage was grainy, but the desperation in his voice was clear. He kept referring to something he called the darkness, and spoke of making preparations to protect himself. I leaned closer to the screen, my heart pounding. The man's behavior was erratic, but what really got under my skin was the way he talked about strange occurrences around the house, shadows moving on their own, cold spots, and voices whispering when no one was there. It sounded like he was preparing for something far beyond the ordinary. My skin crawled as I watched him set up odd symbols and make strange incantations, mumbling about protecting against the unseen. The footage abruptly cut off, leaving me in silence. I sat there, the room suddenly feeling colder, as if the shadows had grown longer. My mind raced. Why had this man gone to such lengths? And what did it mean for me now? The house was supposed to be my fresh start, but now it felt like I had stepped into something far more sinister. The video left me uneasy, but I tried to shake it off. I told myself it was just the ramblings of a man who had probably been under a lot of stress. I forced myself to focus on the task at hand and decided to clean up the garage. As I moved boxes and swept the floor, the thought of that old camcorder kept nagging at me. I couldn't stop thinking about those bizarre symbols and strange rituals. They seemed so out of place in this ordinary suburban setting. I decided to dig deeper into the house's history. Maybe there was something more to these strange occurrences. I made my way to the attic, where I had seen some old files and records stacked away. Dust swirled around me as I pulled out a large box labeled Documents. Inside, I found old blueprints of the house and a collection of newspaper clippings. Most of them were about minor incidents, a broken pipe, a stolen bike, but one article caught my eye. It was a small, yellowed piece from the local paper, detailing a series of disappearances from years ago. The article mentioned that the disappearances were all connected to the old house and its previous owners. The last line sent a shiver down my spine. Residents report strange phenomena and shadows lurking in the dark. I couldn't believe what I was reading. Had the previous owner known something I didn't? My heart raced as I remembered the footage of the man talking about the darkness. I started to connect the dots. What if the disappearances were related to whatever he was preparing for? I had to know more. The attic was getting colder, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the draft. I decided to search for more information about the previous owner. The articles mentioned a local historian who had looked into the house's history extensively. I found the historian's contact information in one of the old files and decided to give them a call. The phone rang and rang, but there was no answer. As I was about to hang up, I noticed something odd. The air around me seemed to shift, growing colder by the second. I looked up and saw a shadow dart across the room. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but it made my skin crawl. I told myself it was just my imagination, but a deep-seated fear began to creep in. The darkness the man had spoken of was no longer just a theory, it felt real. The historian never called back. I paced the living room, trying to ignore the gnawing sense of dread. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became that the previous owner had been preparing for something unsettling. Whatever it was, it had clearly left its mark on this house. Late that night, as the house settled into an eerie silence, I found myself drawn back to the garage. It was as if the darkness itself was whispering for me to return. I grabbed a flashlight and went downstairs, determined to investigate further. The garage was cold and damp, the air thick with the scent of mildew and old cardboard. I approached the stack of boxes where I had found the camcorder earlier. This time, I noticed something I had missed before, a small wooden box half buried beneath the others. It was intricately carved with symbols similar to those I had seen on the video. My hands trembled as I carefully opened it. Inside, I found a collection of old photographs, each one showing the house in various stages of renovation. But there was something unsettling about them. In some pictures, a dark figure was partially visible in the background. It was faint, almost like a smudge, but its presence was unmistakable. I flipped through the photos, feeling a growing sense of unease. The figure seemed to be watching, always lurking just out of sight. As I examined the last photo, a noise from behind startled me. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping, coming from somewhere in the garage. I swung the flashlight around, but the beam only illuminated empty shelves and dusty tools. The tapping continued, growing louder and more insistent. I could feel my pulse quicken. I was no longer alone in the garage, and whatever was with me was making its presence known. I forced myself to stay calm. "Hello?" I called out, my voice wavering slightly. There was no answer, only the persistent tapping. I walked towards the sound, my footsteps echoing in the emptiness. The tapping suddenly stopped, replaced by an unsettling silence. It was as if whatever was there had retreated into the shadows, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. My hands were slick with sweat as I turned to leave, the oppressive feeling of being watched hanging heavily in the air. The garage felt different the next morning. The shadows seemed deeper, more threatening, and the air was heavy with a chill that hadn't been there before. I forced myself to focus on the tasks at hand, but every creak and groan of the house made my skin crawl. Something about last night's events lingered, a dark cloud that refused to dissipate. I decided to go back to the camcorder, hoping it might offer some clues. I set it up in the living room and pressed play. The footage began with the familiar view of the garage, but this time the image was sharper. The old owner's preparations were methodical. He was setting up what looked like a makeshift shrine. Candles were arranged in a circle, and strange symbols were scrawled on the walls. My heart raced as I watched. The real horror came when the camera's view shifted. The old man, in the middle of arranging the candles, seemed to glance at something just off camera. He looked terrified, his face pale and eyes wide. Then, the image flickered and cut to static for a few seconds. When it cleared, the shrine was in disarray and the man was nowhere to be seen. I rewound the tape and played it again, but the footage was the same. The unsettling feeling gnawed at me, and I couldn't shake the impression that the man had seen something or someone before he vanished. I had to know more. My phone rang, snapping me out of my thoughts. It was a call from the local historical society. The historian was finally on the line, but he had little to offer. "Sorry, Mark, I did some digging, but there's no record of anything unusual about the previous owner. Just a reclusive man who lived alone." Frustration bubbled up inside me. "There's something wrong here," I insisted. "The footage shows him setting up something that looks like a ritual. I need to know what happened to him." The historian's voice grew cautious. "Well, there were rumors about strange occurrences in that area, but nothing concrete. If you're feeling uneasy, maybe it's best to stay away from the garage for a while." I ended the call, feeling more isolated than ever. As I stared at the camcorder, I realized that the old owner's fear was now my own. The tapping sound from last night returned in my mind, and I knew I had to uncover the truth before whatever was in that garage decided to make itself known to me. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Every shadow in the house seemed to stretch and writhe with malevolent intent. The garage, once a place of mundane tasks, had become a site of dread, a place I could no longer ignore. I decided to confront the fear head-on. With a deep breath, I grabbed a flashlight and headed to the garage, determined to uncover the truth. The garage door creaked open, and the familiar, musty smell hit me. I carefully approached the old camcorder, which was still set up on the workbench. The tape was almost full. I couldn't avoid it any longer. I needed to see what was on the rest of that tape. As I rewound the footage, I noticed something strange in the corner of the video. The old man was setting up the candles, but this time I could see a shadow moving behind him. It was subtle at first, just a fleeting shape, but then it became clearer. It was a figure, tall and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through the screen. My breath caught in my throat. The camera cut to static again, and when it cleared, the old man was gone. The shrine was in chaos, and the figure was now standing in the center of the frame. It wasn't just any figure. It was a spectral form with a face twisted in agony. I could almost hear its mournful wail through the static. My heart pounded as I realized what I was looking at. I stumbled back from the camcorder, my mind racing. The figure in the video was no ordinary ghost. It was a manifestation of something much older and darker. I remembered the historian's words, "Stay away from the garage." He must have known something I didn't. As I turned to leave, a cold draft swept through the garage, extinguishing the flashlight and plunging the room into darkness. I fumbled to relight it, but when the beam finally cut through the blackness, I froze. The shadow from the video was now in the garage with me. It moved with a slow, deliberate grace, closing in on me. Panic surged as I backed away, but the shadow seemed to follow my every move. It was as if it was feeding on my fear, growing stronger with each step I took. In a desperate attempt to escape, I dashed for the door, but it slammed shut with a deafening bang. I was trapped. The shadow's whisper was like ice against my skin. It spoke of lost souls and unfinished business, of a curse that had claimed the previous owner and now sought to claim me. As the darkness closed in, I realized the true horror. I was not merely a witness. I was part of the cycle, destined to join the ranks of the trapped souls if I couldn't break free. In that moment, as the cold crept closer, I understood the chilling truth. The garage wasn't just a site of horror, it was a gateway. And now, it was my turn to be part of the darkness that had lingered here for so long. The day had been one of those where everything felt heavier than usual, and my apartment in Los Angeles was no refuge. After a grueling week filled with back-to-back sessions and endless paperwork, I craved nothing more than a quiet night to myself. My name is Chloe, and I'm a psychologist. I've learned to handle the complexities of the human mind, but tonight, It felt like I was wrestling with something beyond my expertise. I was in the middle of organizing the clutter that had accumulated in the closet of my spare room when I stumbled across an old tape recorder. It was buried beneath a pile of dusty boxes, its once polished surface now tarnished with age. The sight of it was oddly intriguing. I wondered why anyone would leave such an antiquated piece of equipment behind. Curiosity got the better of me, and I carefully retrieved it. The tape recorder was heavier than I expected. It had a reassuring solidity to it, almost as if it carried secrets within its mechanisms. As I examined it, I noticed several old tapes neatly stacked beside it. Each one was labeled with a date and a name that didn't ring any bells for me. The feeling of unease was subtle but present. It was like opening a door to a room I had no intention of entering. I set the tape recorder on my coffee table and, with a mix of curiosity and skepticism, decided to play one of the tapes. The mechanism whirred to life with an unexpected ease. Static crackled before a muffled voice began speaking. The voice was calm, collected, and detached, too detached for comfort. I sat on the edge of my couch, my mind racing as the words filled the room. "Today's session is for patient number 12, the voice droned. I leaned in closer, straining to catch every word. The speaker described mundane aspects of therapy, the weather, the patient's mood, their struggles. It seemed like a routine session, but something about it felt off. Maybe it was the voice, or perhaps the realization that these were not my sessions. I tried to ignore the creeping discomfort and focused on the task at hand. As the evening wore on, I continued listening, each tape revealing more about the previous occupant's therapy practices. The descriptions of the people and their issues were foreign to me, and though I tried to remain detached, a growing sense of dread settled over me. What started as innocent curiosity began to feel like I was peering into something I shouldn't have. The voices on the tapes, the eerie tone, and the unfamiliar names, all of it started to gnaw at my composure. I decided to take a break, but the thought of the tape recorder, left alone in the dimly lit room, seemed to whisper at the edges of my mind. The voice on the tape continued with an unnervingly calm detachment, as if each word was meticulously chosen to unsettle. My rational mind struggled to maintain control, but the sense that I was being drawn into something far beyond ordinary grew stronger. I tried to shake off the disquieting feeling that had settled over me. It was probably just my exhaustion playing tricks on my mind. I forced myself to focus on the task at hand, but the curiosity about the tapes gnawed at me. I knew I should just leave them alone, but I couldn't shake the urge to know more. With a deep breath, I returned to the tape recorder. The room felt colder now, though the temperature hadn't changed. I pressed play on a new tape, trying to ignore the mounting sense of dread. The static crackled once more, and then the voice emerged, still calm, still unsettling. "This session is from April 12th, 1992. The voice began. It was the same monotonous tone as before, but the content was different. The speaker described an event with unnerving detail, an argument between the patient and someone they cared about. The way the speaker described the argument made it feel less like a recording and more like a live account. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being drawn into the speaker's world. I glanced around my apartment, half expecting to see someone or something watching me. The room was empty, save for the tape recorder and me. Yet, the unsettling feeling persisted. The voice on the tape continued with its detached recounting of events, but now the description seemed too precise. It was as if the speaker was detailing not just past events, but what was happening in real time. "Mark was agitated," the voice said, describing a man I didn't know. He felt trapped in his own home. My heart skipped a beat. The description sounded eerily similar to my own feelings of claustrophobia in the apartment. I couldn't believe how closely it mirrored my own experiences. I could almost feel Mark's anxiety, his sense of being cornered. The realization chilled me to the bone. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the tapes were just a collection of well-done role-playing scenarios or dramatic readings. But then I heard it again. The faint, almost imperceptible noise in the background. It wasn't quite like static, it sounded like whispers. My skin prickled as the whispers seemed to grow louder. I pressed stop, but the whispers didn't fade. They lingered in the quiet, just out of reach, filling the space with an unsettling presence. I could hardly breathe. I told myself it was just the fatigue messing with my senses. I shut off the tape recorder and tried to ignore the voices that seemed to echo in my mind. The apartment felt colder, more oppressive. The tapes were supposed to be a curiosity, a glimpse into someone else's past. Instead, they had become a haunting presence that I couldn't escape. As I sat in the dim light of my living room, I knew I had to keep listening. There was something here that I needed to understand, no matter how much it frightened me. I couldn't ignore the tapes any longer. Each time I tried to distract myself, my mind would drift back to them. My curiosity was quickly morphing into obsession. Every tape seemed to unravel another layer of the mystery, pulling me deeper into something I couldn't yet understand. One evening, after another exhausting day at work, I found myself in the dim light of my living room, the tape recorder glaring at me like an accusing eye. I put on a new tape, hoping it might offer some semblance of normalcy. Instead, the voice on the tape was more unsettling than ever. Session from August 21st, 1992, it began. But this time, the tone held an almost sinister edge. The voice described a person in extreme distress, someone struggling with isolation and fear. The descriptions were vivid and disturbing: crawling shadows, whispers in the dark, and a sense of being watched. I was drawn in, unable to tear my eyes away from the flickering light of the tape player. I tried to rationalize it, convincing myself that the details were just coincidental. After all, it wasn't uncommon for people to experience fear in isolation. But as the tape continued, the scenes described began to mirror what I was feeling in my own apartment. I could almost feel the same oppressive atmosphere described in the recordings. It was as if the tape was capturing not just past events, but my current reality. The moment the tape ended, I noticed a change in the room. The air felt heavier, almost suffocating. The whispers I had heard before seemed louder now, filling the room with a chilling presence. My eyes darted around, searching for the source of the unsettling sound. There was nothing visible, but the sense of being watched was almost palpable. I couldn't deny it anymore. The tape was more than just recordings. It was a bridge to something dark and malevolent. As I sat in the silence that followed, I felt a growing terror. I wanted to stop listening, to shut out the growing fear, but the feeling of dread was overpowering. I knew I had to keep going, to find out what was happening. But the deeper I delved, the more I realized that escaping this nightmare might not be possible. The tapes had become more than a curiosity. They were a horrifying revelation. They spoke of fears and darkness that seemed to seep into my life, threatening to pull me into their depths. As I prepared to listen to the next tape, a chilling thought crossed my mind. What if these recordings were not just a window into someone else's past, but a warning of what was to come? The next tape felt different. My hands shook as I loaded it into the player, and I could barely bring myself to press play. Each hiss and crackle of the tape seemed to echo louder in the silence of my apartment. The voice on the tape was more frantic, more desperate. August 28th, 1992, the voice said. This time, the speaker was recounting something that made my skin crawl. It described strange occurrences, objects moving on their own, unsettling shadows darting across the walls, and an unshakable sense of dread. I felt a chill run down my spine. Every detail seemed to be creeping into my own reality. As I listened, the atmosphere in the room seemed to shift. The temperature dropped, and a cold draft swept through the apartment, making me shiver. I could almost see the shadows growing darker, as if they were manifesting from the tape itself. I could hardly focus on the recording. My attention was drawn to the odd noises around me, the creaking of the floorboards, the whisper of wind against the window panes. The tape described an escalating terror that mirrored what I was experiencing. The speaker's fear was palpable, almost as if it was being transferred directly to me. I tried to dismiss it as coincidence, but my thoughts were interrupted by a loud bang from the hallway. My heart raced as I stood up to investigate. The hallway was empty, but the unease clung to me like a second skin. I returned to the living room, hoping to find some comfort in the familiar. Instead, I found that the room had grown colder, and the shadows seemed to pulse with a life of their own. I could hear faint whispers, just beyond the edge of my hearing. "You're not alone," the voice on the tape had said. I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just a recording, but a message meant for me. I forced myself to keep listening, desperate to understand what was happening. As the tape continued, it described an entity, an invisible force that tormented the speaker, pushing them to the brink of madness. The description of this entity made my breath catch. The voice on the tape had said it was relentless, always watching, always waiting. I glanced around the room, feeling eyes on me, though I saw nothing. The realization dawned on me that the recordings were not just recounting past events. They were part of something ongoing, something that was now affecting me. I felt trapped, caught between the past and present, with no clear way out. I knew I had to confront whatever was causing this, but the thought of facing it made my blood run cold. The more I listened, the more I feared that I was already ensnared in a nightmare from which there was no escape. I was barely able to focus on the final tape. The terror from the previous recordings had left me exhausted, but I knew I had to hear this one through. I held my breath as I pressed play. The tape hissed and crackled, but the voice was calm, almost too calm, given the circumstances. September 5th, 1992, the voice began. The calm tone was unsettling, as if the speaker had resigned themselves to an inevitable fate. The description of events was chilling. The speaker talked about a presence that seemed to seep through the very walls, an entity that fed on fear and despair. The hair on my arm stood up as the voice described it, something that could manipulate reality itself. My anxiety surged as the voice on the tape started to describe events that I was experiencing at that very moment. The walls whisper your name, it said. I looked around the room, my pulse quickening. The whispers were louder now, filling the room with a cacophony of hushed voices. I could barely make out what they were saying, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. Look behind you, the voice on the tape said abruptly. My heart pounded as I slowly turned around. There, in the dim light, was a shadowy figure, barely discernible but unmistakably there. My breathing grew ragged. I tried to convince myself it was a trick of the light, but the figure moved, its presence growing more defined. The tape continued, describing the final moments of the speaker's descent into madness. They spoke of a horrifying realization that the entity was not just haunting them, but had become a part of them. The speaker had discovered too late that the entity had the power to control and distort their perception of reality. The realization struck me like a punch to the gut. If what the speaker said was true, then whatever was tormenting them was now tormenting me. As the tape ended, an eerie silence filled the room. My own reflection in the dark window seemed strange and unfamiliar. The whispers had ceased, but the fear lingered, clawing at the edges of my sanity. I realized with dread that I was no longer sure what was real. The line between the recordings and my reality had blurred, and I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being drawn deeper into the nightmare. I tried to calm myself, but the room seemed to close in around me. The revelation was horrifying. The entity on the tape was not just a haunting, it was a malevolent force capable of bending reality. I was now part of its twisted game. The sensation of being watched returned, stronger than ever. I felt an icy grip on my heart, knowing that whatever was out there was not just watching, but preparing to make its move. The fear was no longer confined to the tapes. It was inside me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the real horror was just beginning. It was supposed to be a quiet night. I'd promised myself I'd stay in and get ahead on my work, a critical project that had been eating up my time for weeks. My house in Portland was unusually silent, the only sound coming from the gentle hum of my computer. I was immersed in code, trying to untangle a particularly nasty bug when my screen flickered. The sudden interruption made me jump. A message appeared in my inbox, marked from an unknown account. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe it was spam or a glitch. The message read, "I know what you did last summer." I laughed it off, dismissing it as an attempt at humor or a prank. But as I clicked away, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Something about the message felt off. As the hours passed, the messages kept coming. They were no longer just random jabs, but contained details I'd never shared online. My work schedule, my commute times, even my lunch breaks. I found myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting someone to be lurking in the shadows of my office. "How did they know this?" I muttered, trying to dismiss it as a fluke or a mistake. I decided to run a thorough check on my network, convinced that some sort of malware had slipped past my defenses. Every scan came up clean. Nothing was out of place. No unauthorized devices, no strange logs. I even reset my router, hoping it would clear whatever ghost was haunting my connection. Yet, the messages persisted, growing more sinister with each one. "You're always alone, aren't you?" they taunted. "Nobody will save you." My anxiety began to spiral. It wasn't just the messages anymore, it was everything. I'd catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, only to find nothing there. I'd hear creaks and groans from the house that I knew couldn't be explained by settling wood. Every little sound made me jump. "Am I losing it?" I questioned aloud, feeling the weight of isolation bear down on me. As the night wore on, the messages became more specific, detailing actions I was about to take before I even made them. They started predicting my movements, and with every prediction that came true, my sense of security crumbled. It felt as though someone was watching my every move, and the thought of not knowing who or what it was sent a chill down my spine. I knew I had to find the source before the creeping dread turned into something far worse. I stared at my computer screen, my eyes bloodshot from hours of trying to make sense of the cryptic messages. The latest one read, "I see you're still awake." My heart raced. I wasn't just dealing with a prank or an automated bot. This felt personal, and the way the messages mirrored my own fears was unnerving. I took a deep breath and decided to focus on the physical realm. I checked every room of my house, flipping on lights and peering into every shadow. Each room was exactly as I'd left it. Nothing seemed out of place. I even checked the windows and doors, making sure everything was locked tight. I felt silly, like a child checking under the bed for monsters, but the sense of unease was undeniable. Back at my desk, I noticed a new message. It contained a photograph of my backyard, taken from what looked like the exact spot where I was standing. I snapped my head around, glancing out the window. The backyard was dark and empty, nothing out of the ordinary. My mind raced. "This can't be happening," I muttered to myself. "There's got to be a logical explanation." I checked the camera feeds from my home security system, but everything appeared normal. The cameras showed no signs of tampering, and no one had entered my property. I even looked at the logs, but there was no indication of any unusual activity. The only thing that made sense was that someone had access to my network and was sending these messages from inside my home. But how? The realization that someone could be so close yet remain completely invisible sent a shiver down my spine. I tried calling my security provider, hoping they could help me trace the source. As I explained the situation, the voice on the other end was calm but unhelpful, offering standard advice on securing my network. "Check your router settings," they suggested. "Change your passwords." It felt like they were missing the gravity of the situation. I followed their advice, changing passwords and updating my router settings, but the messages didn't stop. They continued to come, each one more menacing than the last. "You're getting closer," one said. "You're looking for me, but I'm already in your head." The fear was palpable, and the idea that someone or something was manipulating me from the shadows began to drive me to the edge of sanity. My hands trembled as I tried to maintain focus, but the creeping paranoia made every creak in the house sound like a threat. As the hours ticked by, the messages kept coming, each more disturbing than the last. I tried to convince myself it was a prank, but the depth of detail in each message made that impossible. One night, the message read, "You're not alone." My pulse quickened. I could hear the faintest sound of scratching from the corner of the room where my closet was. I swallowed hard and tried to focus, but my eyes kept darting to that shadowy spot. I crept towards the closet, the wooden floor creaking under my weight. My hand shook as I reached for the handle, but when I opened it, nothing was inside. I pushed aside old coats and winter jackets, but the closet was empty. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to calm myself. "Get a grip, Ethan," I told myself. "It's just your mind playing tricks." Returning to my computer, I tried to trace the messages again. I dug through the logs, searching for any clue as to who might be behind this. The more I looked, the more I felt like I was being watched. The glow of the screen seemed to intensify the shadows around me, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being scrutinized. I glanced over my shoulder, but nothing was there. I decided to take a break and make a pot of coffee, hoping the caffeine would clear my foggy mind. As I walked through the kitchen, I noticed something odd, a small note pinned to the fridge. It read, "They're closer than you think." My breath hitched. I was alone in the house. How did this note get here? I looked around frantically, but there were no signs of forced entry or tampering. My hands trembled as I called the police, but when I explained the situation, the officer on the other end seemed skeptical. "We don't have any records of a break-in, Mr. Warren," he said. "Without more evidence, there's not much we can do." I felt a wave of frustration. "I need you to come here," I insisted. "I'm telling you, someone's messing with me." After the call ended, I felt an overwhelming sense of isolation. I turned back to my computer, only to find a new message waiting. "Look behind you." My skin crawled as I slowly turned around. My heart raced as I scanned the room. Every shadow and every corner seemed to hold a potential threat. I was on edge, convinced that something was closing in on me, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly what. The line between reality and paranoia was blurring, and I was left with a gnawing fear that I was losing control of my own mind. The darkness seemed to grow heavier around me, and every creak of the house felt amplified. I was shaking uncontrollably as I sat in front of my computer. The last message I received read, "You're closer than you think." I stared at the screen, my mind racing. My eyes darted to the shadows, each one morphing into something more sinister in my paranoia. I took a deep breath and decided to take another look at the network activity logs. I was desperate for any clue that might explain how this was happening. I noted that there was an unfamiliar device connected to my network. My stomach churned. I traced the IP address, but it led to nowhere, just an empty shell with no identifying information. My frustration grew. Who was doing this, and why were they so intent on tormenting me? Suddenly, I heard a loud thud coming from the basement. My heart leaped into my throat. The basement was always a source of unease for me, filled with old boxes and forgotten junk. I hesitated, my mind racing through every possible scenario. If this was a prank, it was taking an unsettlingly realistic turn. Summoning every ounce of courage, I grabbed a flashlight and headed for the basement door. Each step down the creaky stairs felt like a mile. I could feel the cold air becoming more intense as I descended. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating dusty old furniture and stacks of boxes. The thud had stopped, but the silence was just as unsettling. I approached the source of the sound, a heavy wooden crate shoved against the wall. My hand trembled as I lifted the lid, revealing old, dusty electronics and yellowed papers. I was about to turn away when something caught my eye, a small, silver object buried under the debris. It was a USB drive, its surface reflecting the light. As I picked it up, a chill ran down my spine. I could feel someone's presence in the room, even though I was alone. I had to know if this USB drive had anything to do with the messages. I plugged it into my computer, hoping for answers. The screen flickered, and a file opened automatically. It was a video file. My hands were clammy as I pressed play. The video began with static, and then focused on a familiar scene, my living room. The camera panned slowly, capturing details of the room, including the very spot where I was sitting. My heart raced as the camera zoomed in on my desk and then panned to the empty corner where the note had appeared. I realized with a growing sense of horror that this footage was recorded recently. My fear spiked as I saw the figure in the shadows, obscured and indistinct, but undeniably present. I was being watched, and it was clear that someone or something knew every detail of my life. My breath came in shallow gasps as the video played, each frame revealing more of the room where I was sitting. The shadows in the footage twisted and moved with a malevolent energy, making my skin crawl. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the screen, even as the figure in the shadows grew clearer. It seemed to be watching me, but from where? A sinking feeling of dread filled me as I realized that the figure was not just a figment of my imagination, it was a real presence, lurking just beyond my vision. My head spun as I tried to piece together what was happening. I couldn't ignore the creeping thought that this nightmare was far from over. I needed answers, but everything was slipping through my fingers like sand. I snapped the USB drive out of my computer and ran back upstairs, my mind racing. I felt like a trapped animal, and the walls of my house seemed to close in around me. The messages, the video, the dark presence, they all pointed to something insidious and personal. I needed to confront this, but how could I fight something I couldn't see? Just as I was about to call the police, I heard a faint rustling sound behind me. My heart pounded as I spun around. The living room was empty, but the feeling of being watched was overpowering. I grabbed a baseball bat from the closet and edged toward the noise, each step echoing ominously in the silence. I reached the source of the sound, the old cabinet where I had found the USB drive. The door was slightly ajar, and I could see a sliver of something shiny. Hesitantly, I pulled the door open wider. There, sitting among the clutter, was a familiar device, my own webcam. My blood ran cold as I realized it was the same model I used for video calls. The camera was pointing directly at me. It was then that I noticed a new, small message on my computer screen. "You've been the subject of our study. It's time to see how much you've learned." The screen flickered, and for a brief moment, I saw the figure from the video again. Only now, it was right behind me, its face a hollow mask of shadows. I spun around, but there was nothing there. The room felt as though it had grown colder, and the oppressive silence was almost deafening. My hands trembled as I fumbled with my phone, trying to call for help, but the signal was gone. The realization hit me like a freight train. I had been watched and manipulated all along. The true horror wasn't just the presence in my home. It was the knowledge that someone had been observing me every moment, controlling the very fabric of my reality. I was no longer just a victim. I was a participant in a twisted game with no clear escape. The fear of knowing that someone, or something, could invade every aspect of my life without my awareness was paralyzing. The worst part was the chilling certainty that this was only the beginning. When I arrived at the cabin, the first thing I noticed was the silence. It was so complete, it felt like it was pressing against my eardrums. The cabin, tucked away in the Colorado mountains, was everything I hoped for: rustic, quaint, and isolated. The kind of place where you could imagine the world falling away, leaving nothing but yourself and your thoughts. I stepped out of my car and took in the crisp, cold air. The silence here was different from the city's noise. It was an oppressive, almost tangible quiet. Inside, the cabin had an old-world charm, with wooden beams and creaking floorboards. I set up my writing desk by the window, hoping the view of the snow-capped peaks would spark some creativity. The fire crackled in the stone hearth, its warm glow a stark contrast to the cold outside. I was ready to embrace the solitude, convinced it would help me overcome the writer's block that had plagued me for months. But as night fell and the darkness crept in, the silence seemed to shift. It started subtly at first. While I was typing, I heard faint echoes, words repeating back to me in a way that wasn't quite right. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or perhaps the cabin settling into the night. But the echoes continued, growing slightly more distorted with each repetition. I could almost make out my own words twisted into something threatening. I told myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on my mind. I was alone in a strange place, and that alone was enough to make me question my senses. As the hours passed, the echoes became more persistent. It was as though someone or something was mimicking me, distorting my fears, my frustrations, turning them into a grotesque version of themselves. The more I listened, the more unnerved I became. It was as if the cabin itself was alive, resonating with a dark presence that I couldn't quite understand. I tried to focus on my work, but my concentration was shattered by the growing cacophony of distorted echoes. I decided to investigate the source of the sound. I searched every corner of the cabin, checking for loose pipes or anything that could cause the strange reverberations. I even ventured outside, hoping that the cold air might clear my mind. But nothing seemed out of place, and the sound persisted. I found myself peering into the darkness, feeling an unsettling sensation that I was being watched. My footsteps echoed louder than usual, amplifying my growing dread. Sitting back down at my desk, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong. The echoes seemed to follow me, taunting me with whispers of my deepest fears. It was more than just an auditory illusion. It felt like a presence was trying to invade my mind. I began to wonder if the isolation was affecting my sanity, or if there was something truly malevolent at play. The boundaries between my reality and this unnerving experience were beginning to blur, leaving me trapped in a nightmare that I couldn't escape. The echoing started to take on a more sinister tone as the night deepened. I sat in front of my laptop, desperately trying to drown out the echoes with the soft clatter of my typing, but the sounds were relentless. They seemed to originate from all around me, a haunting symphony of my own voice twisted into something eerie. I muttered to myself, trying to steady my nerves. "It's just the isolation," I told myself. "It's messing with your mind." I turned up the volume on my music player, hoping that familiar tunes might help. But as the melodies played, they were distorted, as though they too were affected by whatever was causing the echoes. The music couldn't mask the underlying sense of dread that was creeping in. My heart raced with each distorted phrase that seemed to echo louder than the last. The echoes now clearly mimicked my own anxieties, fears I'd tried to bury deep within myself. The worst part was the way the echoes seemed to evolve. At first, they were just unsettling repetitions of my thoughts. Now, they began to form full sentences, each more disturbing than the last. I could hear phrases like, "You're not alone, and it's watching you," repeating in a distorted, mocking tone. My skin prickled with a cold sweat, and I found myself glancing nervously around the room, half expecting to see someone, or something, lurking in the shadows. I took a deep breath and decided to investigate the source of the echoes again. I wandered through the cabin, running my hands along the walls, searching for any irregularities. Every creak of the floorboards seemed amplified, every shadow deeper and more menacing. I checked the old pipes and vents, convinced that there must be a simple, rational explanation. But everything appeared to be in order, and the source of the sound remained elusive. I returned to my writing desk, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the cold air outside. The echoing voices grew louder and more insistent, now interspersed with what sounded like sinister laughter. I pressed my hands against my ears, trying to block out the sounds, but it was as though they were inside my head. I could feel my mind beginning to fray at the edges. "This can't be real," I whispered to myself. "It's just a trick of the mind." The cabin seemed to close in on me, the silence between the echoes amplifying my growing paranoia. The walls felt as though they were shifting, the darkness creeping closer. I started to question my own sanity. Was this the isolation playing tricks on me, or was something truly malevolent trying to communicate through these disturbing echoes? The line between reality and nightmare was becoming increasingly blurred, and I felt more trapped than ever before. The echoes had transformed from mere noise into a direct assault on my sanity, and I couldn't escape their haunting grip. By the time the clock struck midnight, I felt as though I was teetering on the edge of a precipice. The echoes had shifted from mere disturbances into a sinister, almost sentient presence. I could barely concentrate on my work anymore. My fingers trembled as I typed. Every now and then, I would glance up, only to be met with the oppressive darkness of the cabin, which seemed to grow thicker and more menacing with each passing minute. The echoes began to take on a more personal tone. They were no longer just distorted repetitions of my thoughts, but seemed to address me directly. "You're hiding something," they whispered. "It's coming for you." My stomach nodded at the sound, and I could feel my pulse quicken. I forced myself to stand and paced around the room, hoping movement would clear my mind, but the feeling of being watched only intensified. I decided to check the windows, thinking perhaps there was a logical explanation for the strange occurrences. The glass was cold beneath my fingers as I peered outside. The night was still and silent, with nothing but the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. Yet, as I turned back to the cabin, I caught a glimpse of something, an indistinct shadow moving just beyond the edge of the trees. I rubbed my eyes, convinced it was a trick of the light, but the unease persisted. Returning to my desk, I noticed something alarming. The shadows in the room seemed to be shifting on their own. They moved with a will of their own, stretching and contorting in unnatural ways. I could hear faint whispers accompanying their movements, a constant, unsettling murmur that I couldn't quite make out. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. In an attempt to regain control, I grabbed the old tape recorder I'd found earlier and played one of the tapes. I hoped it might provide some clarity, or at least a distraction. Instead, I was met with a chilling realization. The voice on the tape was eerily similar to the echoes I had been hearing. The voice spoke of betrayal and fear, recounting events with a disturbing precision. Each word seemed to resonate with my own growing dread. The final straw came when I found myself unable to shake the feeling that I was being actively pursued by an unseen entity. The air felt thick with malevolence, and every shadow seemed to hold a hidden threat. My breaths grew shallow as I tried to reason with myself, but the echoes were relentless. "It's only your imagination," I muttered, but even as I spoke, I knew the truth. The echoes were no longer just sounds. They were a conduit to something far darker. My grip on reality was slipping, and the isolation of the cabin was closing in on me. As the hours ticked by, the oppressive weight of fear seemed to hang heavier with every passing moment. I tried to tell myself that the echoes were nothing more than a result of the isolation and fatigue. But as the night deepened, reality seemed to twist around me in increasingly sinister ways. I decided to confront the source of the echoes directly. I spoke aloud, trying to maintain a semblance of control. "What do you want from me?" I demanded, my voice trembling despite my efforts to sound firm. The response was immediate and chilling. The echoes mirrored my words, but twisted them into something far more menacing. "What do you want from me? You're not safe." The air in the cabin grew colder, and the shadows began to writhe in a manner that seemed almost sentient. The flickering light from the fireplace cast distorted shapes on the walls, and I couldn't help but feel as if the very room was conspiring against me. My own reflection in the mirror seemed to sneer back at me with a cruel, mocking grin. I felt like a stranger in my own skin, the line between reality and nightmare blurring with every passing minute. Determined to end the torment, I grabbed the old tape recorder and fast-forwarded through the remaining tapes. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. Then, one tape caught my attention with a chilling clarity. It was a recording of a woman's voice, distraught and pleading. She spoke of a terrible event that had occurred in this very cabin years ago, of a hidden past that was now reaching out to me. My heart raced as I tried to piece together the fragments of the story. The woman's voice described a tragic accident, a betrayal, and a vengeful spirit that sought retribution. Her words matched the growing sense of dread I felt, as if they were unraveling a mystery I had inadvertently walked into. The echoes seemed to respond to the tape, becoming more aggressive, as if they were feeding off my fear. In a final desperate attempt to regain control, I turned off the tape recorder and tried to calm my breathing. I sat in silence, hoping that the cessation of noise would bring some peace. But the silence was deceiving. The echoes continued to murmur, now more directly, almost as if whispering secrets in my ear. I couldn't tell if the sounds were in my head or if something truly malevolent was at play. The shadows in the room seemed to grow darker and more menacing, and I knew that whatever was haunting me wasn't going to let me go easily. I stared at the door, knowing that stepping outside would mean facing the dark mountain wilderness. Yet staying here felt like an even worse fate. My thoughts spiraled into a pit of despair. Had I unknowingly become part of a larger, darker story that was now playing out in front of me? The echo had become more than just a sound. It was a harbinger of something far more sinister, and I could no longer tell where the real world ended and the nightmare began. The darkness in the cabin seemed to thicken as the night wore on. My attempts to stay calm were failing. Each corner of the room seemed to pulse with a malevolent presence, as if the shadows themselves were alive and watching. My heart raced, and my breaths came in ragged gasps. I could no longer distinguish between my own terror and the supernatural forces that seemed to be closing in on me. The echoes had become increasingly distorted, merging into a cacophony of unsettling whispers. "You can't escape," they taunted. "The past will consume you." I was desperate to understand what was happening, to find any shred of normality in this escalating madness. I decided to confront the source of my fear head-on. I stood up, my legs unsteady, and moved towards the old wardrobe where I'd first found the tapes. I yanked open the doors and stared at the pile of old audio equipment and dusty belongings. My eyes fell on an old journal buried beneath the clutter. With trembling hands, I pulled it out and opened it. The pages were filled with frantic scribbles and cryptic notes. As I read, a horrifying realization dawned on me. The notes detailed not only the traumatic event described on the tapes, but also a series of rituals intended to summon a vengeful spirit. I could feel the temperature in the room drop further. The echoes grew louder, almost deafening. "You know too much," they hissed. I turned around, expecting to see something, anything, manifesting from the shadows. But the room was still, almost unnervingly so. The silence that followed was thick and oppressive. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. I looked back at the journal. One page stood out, marked with a red stain. It described a final ritual, one that required a willing participant to complete. I realized with a sinking dread that I was now a part of this twisted narrative. The echoes were not just haunting my mind, they were guiding me towards a fate already sealed by the previous occupants of this cabin. The final blow came when I noticed a chilling entry dated for tonight. It detailed the exact sequence of events that had just occurred in my cabin, from the discovery of the journal to the sinister whispers. It was as if someone had written out my own nightmare before it even happened. My blood ran cold as I understood the full scope of my predicament. I wasn't just haunted by echoes, I was part of a continuous cycle of terror. The spirits of those who had suffered before me were trapped, and now I was their latest victim. I could feel a presence behind me, closing in, as the echoes rose to a crescendo of menacing glee. The boundaries of reality and nightmare dissolved into one dark, all-consuming abyss. As I turned around one last time, the room seemed to collapse into an endless void, and the chilling realization hit me. There was no escape. The echoes, the rituals, and the journal, they were all pieces of a macabre puzzle that I had unwittingly completed. And now, there was no way out. The cabin had claimed another soul, and I was its latest prisoner, forever bound to the dark legacy of those who had come before me.